A snowstorm. A porch light flickered behind an old wood door, and there they stood, two shadows in the snow, a woman holding a child too tightly to cry. The wind howled across the bare fields like it had teeth, gnashing and spitting at anything warm. Inside the small wooden house at the edge of Briar Hollow, Ben adjusted a kettle on the stove and glanced out the window. The blizzard was worse than the radio said. It usually was. His life was quiet. Clean rows of chopped firewood, toast, with honey each morning, and his 8-year-old son Eli playing on the rug with toy dinosaurs. They were tucked into their routine like spoons in a drawer. Safe. Predictable. Then came the knock. Not loud. Almost unsure. Ben hesitated. He rarely had visitors, especially not in weather like this. When he opened the door, the wind rushed in, but it was the sight that struck him harder. A woman in a long coat, soaked through, eyes rimmed red but dry. She held a child, a girl maybe 5 or 6, wrapped tightly in a thin blanket. Her face buried in the woman's shoulder, unmoving. "I'm sorry," the woman said, her voice almost lost in the wind. "We don't mean to. Can we just warm up for a minute, please? Just her feet." Ben stared for a breath, then stepped aside. Inside, the woman peeled the wet coat from her daughter with hands that trembled more from fear than cold. The girl's left leg was encased in a brace, worn and slightly too large. She didn't speak or make a sound. She just clung to the woman like a branch in a storm. Ben took a blanket from the couch and handed it to the woman without a word. She sat down slowly, cradling the child close, murmuring things he couldn't quite hear. Maybe not even words, just shapes of comfort. Eli peeked from the hallway, wide-eyed. Ben gestured gently, and the boy inched closer. He knelt by the child and placed his favorite toy truck on the cushion beside her. Bright red, chipped at the edges. The girl didn't reach for it, but she looked at him. That was enough. "I'm Claire," the woman said eventually. "This is Rosie," Ben nodded. "Ben, that's Eli." "Thank you," she whispered, still holding Rosie close. "We didn't have anywhere else." Ben said nothing. He poured 3 mugs of tea and placed them on the coffee table. Claire didn't touch hers at first, just stared at the steam. Her fingers finally reached for the handle like it was a lifeline. The clock ticked on. The room filled with quiet warmth. Ben didn't ask questions. Claire didn't offer answers. They just listened to the wind claw at the windows while Rosie fell asleep curled against her mother. When the kettle whistled again, Ben refilled the mugs and brought out a faded quilt. Claire lifted Rosie gently and laid her on the couch. The child didn't stir. Her face was pale and small. Eli sat on the floor beside her, watching over her like a tiny freckled guardian. Claire exhaled and leaned back, rubbing her eyes. "She hasn't said a word in over a year," she said softly. "Not since—" She stopped. Ben didn't press. He just nodded and turned toward the hallway. But before he disappeared, he returned, set a second pillow gently on the couch beside Rosie. Claire blinked hard. He said nothing, just turned off the porch light and walked away. Snow covered the windowsills in a soft hush that muffled time. Morning came not with a jolt but with a slow warm bloom. Fire crackling to life, kettle on the stove, and the smell of toast curling through the house like a welcome back. They were supposed to leave. Claire had said it that first night, her voice apologetic but clear. Just one night. But then came a second and a third. There was no decision made aloud, just the quiet understanding that passed between glances and gestures. When Claire woke one morning to find a folded towel and a toothbrush still in its packaging laid by the sink, she understood. Rosie, too, found a new rhythm. Mornings became her balm. Sunlight angling through the window just right onto the old couch where she liked to lie. Eli brought her picture books, and she pointed at birds and trees without speaking. But her eyes were bright now. Once, when Eli dropped a pancake on the floor with a surprised, "Whoa!" she laughed, just once. But it cracked the room open like a sunbeam through cloud. Claire did small things to repay the kindness. She washed dishes slowly by hand, as if the act itself might stitch her nerves back together. She folded Ben's flannels. One afternoon when she found the basket full, soft, warm shirts that smelled like cedarwood and old fires. She held one briefly to her face and closed her eyes, then kept folding. Ben didn't speak much more than usual, but his gestures lengthened. He started putting an extra slice of toast on the plate. He built a small ramp outside the front steps without a word. Just one afternoon, it was there. Claire stood on the porch staring at it for a long time, Rosie in her arms. Her mouth quivered but didn't open. She turned back inside and found Ben stacking kindling, as if nothing had happened. "Thank you," she managed. He nodded once. "Snow's coming again." In the evenings, sometimes Claire would sit across from Ben in the glow of the fire. Eli would fall asleep, curled on the rug, a book on his chest, his fingers twitching like they were still turning pages in a dream. Claire and Ben would listen to the old radio, faint piano, the scratch of vinyl, sometimes a voice reading the weather with slow, practiced calm. There was no talk, but it wasn't silence either. It was presence. One night, when the fire was low and the house was completely still, Claire sat alone and unfolded a worn piece of paper from her pocket. It was creased and smudged, the ink slightly blurred from the time she cried holding it. It was a letter she wrote to her ex-husband, a letter she never sent. She read it aloud, softly, to the sleeping house. "You never learned how to hold silence without shame. That's why you left her. That's why we're here." She folded it again, held it in both hands like something sacred and cursed. In the morning she opened the stove, placed the letter inside, and watched the flames consume it. The ashes curled upward like tiny black feathers. She shut the door gently and made eggs. Later that same day, she looked out the window and saw Rosie's hands pressed to the glass, her breath fogging the pain. Ben was outside clearing snow from the porch. Then he disappeared into the shed and came out holding something small, a pair of snow boots, still tagged, red with fur trim, the exact size Rosie needed. Claire stepped out just as he knelt to put them on her. Rosie looked up at him, still quiet, but still. "You didn't have to," Claire said. He didn't look up. They were on sale. She didn't argue, just knelt beside him and fastened the straps. That afternoon the snow stopped, the wind quieted, and the sky held that strange blue stillness that comes only after a storm. Rosie stood on the porch, tiny hands gripping the railing. Her eyes flicked toward the yard, toward the untouched white canvas beyond. Then, slowly, she stepped forward. 1, 2, 3 steps, alone. Claire's breath hitched in her throat. Her hand flew to her mouth. Eli, standing beside her, let out a little whoop and clapped with both hands. Ben didn't move, just stood a little taller. His coat collar turned up against the chill, hands buried in his pockets. His jaw clenched, not from the cold, but from holding back whatever emotion pressed against his ribs. The snow boots crunched gently, and in that quiet, winter-white moment, something broke and something mended, both without sound. The house creaked sometimes in the night, the way old places do when they remember. But no one stirred. There was a comfort now in the silence. Not emptiness, but presence, layered and lived in. They no longer said Ben's house or the house at all. It became home, though no one declared it. It was in the way Claire reached for the mugs without asking, placing them in the cupboard just so. In the way Eli began introducing things with Rosie and I, as if she'd always been his sister. And in the way Ben started building without being asked, a low garden box near the porch, a rail along the hallway wall, a shelf for Claire's tea. He carved her name into the back of the shelf, tiny and hidden. Rosie's words came like snowflakes, one at a time, hesitant but real. Mama. First, then Yui, her tongue still struggling with the L. One night, as Claire folded laundry on the couch, Rosie tugged gently on the hem of her sweater, looked toward the man by the fire, and whispered, "Ben." Claire's hand flew to her mouth. She didn't speak, just stepped into the hallway, sat on the stairs, and let the sobs come. Quiet, racking, not meant for anyone but the shadows. Ben never looked up from the fire. But later, when everyone was asleep, he went out to the shed and opened a drawer tucked beneath his workbench. From it, He pulled a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges, soft from being read too many times. It was a letter. He'd written it years ago, to a woman who'd never read it. His wife. Gone the same day Eli arrived in the world. Gone, before she could teach Eli to speak, or sing lullabies to anyone. His handwriting was blocky and careful. You would have loved them, it said. You'd say Rosie's laughter sounds like rain. And you'd be right. He folded it back into thirds and placed it carefully in the drawer again. But things don't stay untouched forever. One afternoon, a knock on the door. Claire opened it, holding Rosie's hand, and froze. A man in a suit, eyes too familiar, cold, controlled. He didn't ask to come in. "I've sent a lawyer," he said. "You know why," and Claire did. Her heart sank through the floor. She didn't answer, just nodded once and closed the door. That night, she packed. Not everything, just enough for flight. She moved quietly, placing Rosie's shoes in the same canvas bag they'd carried in months ago. But Rosie clung to Eli when it came time to leave. She shook her head. When Claire reached for her, Rosie screamed, "No!" The sound was loud, the kind of sound that turned the walls into witnesses. Ben stood in the doorway watching. He didn't speak, not at first. Then he walked to his workbench, opened the drawer, and pulled out the letter. He folded it once more, placed it into Claire's hand without explanation. "I know what it's like," he said quietly. "To lose. Someone you don't deserve to lose." She opened it after he left the room. She didn't speak again that night. But she unpacked Rosie's shoes. The days that followed moved strangely. Soft and tense at once. Claire kept expecting the knock again, but it never came. Instead, the town clerk showed up, brought cocoa, sat on the porch with Claire, her breath forming small clouds in the cold. "I heard about the boots," she said. "About the steps." Claire didn't know what to say. The clerk reached into her coat. "There are forms we can file, quiet ones. Ben's old friend from the army, the one who ran the hardware store, came by later that week with a stack of firewood. Got you some names," he said to Ben. "People who'll say the right things." It happened without ceremony. No courtroom, no shouting. Just a quiet letter returned unopened to Claire's ex. No forwarding address. No more threats. Rosie stayed, and each morning, like clockwork, she walked to the same spot in the yard. Snow or no snow, wind or calm. It didn't matter. There was a bench now, small and sturdy, made of reclaimed wood. Ben built it with care, sanding the corners smooth. Rosie climbed onto it each dawn and waited for the light. It became her ritual. Claire would watch from the kitchen, holding a mug with both hands. Eli would sit beside Rosie, sometimes speaking, sometimes silent. And Ben would pass behind them, brushing snow off his shoulders, the scent of cedar and ash trailing behind him. No one asked what the miracle was. It didn't come with lightning, or a choir. It came slow and daily. In laughter over spilled juice, in the smell of laundry fresh from the line, in the feel of small hands trusting yours, again and again. And in the light that broke each morning, softly, over the girl who walked. 2 winters passed. The snow came and went with the quiet rhythm of breath blanketing the roof and sliding slowly off again like time shedding its weight. Inside, the house grew full. Not louder, just deeper. The kind of full that seeps into floorboards, into flannel shirts, into the smell of cinnamon that lingered even after the bread cooled. Claire opened a pottery studio from the garage that first spring. She didn't call it a business. It was just something she did, hands in clay, music low in the background. People from town came, at first out of curiosity, then to sit and shape mugs that didn't match and bowls that wobbled just right. Ben built her a kiln space. Never said much while he worked, but when it was done, he left a small sign outside the garage door that simply read, "Claire's." The kids grew. Rosie walked steadier with each season. The walking stick she used when she started school became less a need and more a companion, decorated in stickers and glitter and a yarn tassel that Eli helped tie. Her first school project was a drawing, proudly stapled to the classroom wall. It showed a house with a chimney and stars above. In front of the house were 4 figures. One was Ben, unmistakable in his flannel. One was Claire with her red scarf. Then Rosie, smiling, and Eli holding her hand. At the top she wrote in shaky but determined letters, "My 2 dads and 1 mom." Claire found it during parent night. She stepped into the pantry later, clutching a cloth napkin, and wept into it, softly, the way you do when joy catches you too off guard to hide. There were rituals now. Every Sunday, they made cinnamon bread. Claire preparing the dough, Rosie and Eli braiding it carefully with sticky fingers, Ben brushing the tops with melted butter just before the oven closed. There were letters still, but not the kind burned or buried in drawers. These were smaller, sweeter, folded into the toes of boots, slipped under pillows. One from Claire to Ben read simply, "I love the way your silence makes space for everything else to bloom." A photo appeared on the mantel one autumn, taken by the town clerk on a sunny day. It wasn't posed. They were laughing. Rosie had flour on her cheek. Eli held up a worm he'd found in the garden. Ben was mid-blink. Claire's hand was resting on his. It was perfect. The kind of perfect that isn't polished, just true. The kind that lasts. One dusk, late in the fall, when the air was crisp and wood smoke lingered in the collar of every coat, Claire found Ben in the yard. He was adjusting the garden box, talking softly to himself about drainage and frost. She handed him a small envelope. He took it, brow furrowing slightly, then unfolding it like something precious. Inside, her handwriting sloped gently. "I stopped, looking for miracles the day I met you. Turns out you were making them daily." He didn't speak, just looked at her, then folded the paper and placed it carefully in his back pocket like it had always belonged there. From behind them came laughter, high and wild. Rosie was running across the yard, no brace now, her coat flaring behind her like a sail. Eli chased her with a snowball, both of them shrieking like winter had no teeth. Claire turned to watch, her hands tucked in the sleeves of Ben's old coat. She always wore it now when the wind came early. Ben stepped beside her. He didn't say anything. He just stood there. The windows behind them glowed golden, firelight flickering like memory. The bread dough was rising in the kitchen. Tomorrow would come with coffee, with mittens by the door, with Rosie humming while brushing her hair. But tonight there was just this. The slow ache of peace, the kind that stretches softly, like limbs that have been too long curled against cold, and one final truth that settled gently in the space between them. Not all families are born. Some arrive one snowstorm at a time, with boots too big and hearts broken wide open. If this story touched you, subscribe or share where you're watching from. These stories matter, not because they're grand, but because they're quietly true. And sometimes, the softest miracles are the ones we choose, each day.